Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Globe webinar series on the future of global governance. I am Carrie Otterburn of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Today, we are joined by Professor Alexandru Grigorescu to discuss his new book, The Ebb and Flow of Global Governance, Intergovernmentalism versus Non-Governmentalism in World Politics, published this year by Cambridge University Press. Alex is Professor of Political Science and Chair of the Political Science Department of Loyola University Chicago. Prior to his academic career, he worked as a diplomat in the Romanian Foreign Ministry and at the United Nations. In addition to numerous journal articles and chapters and the book we will be discussing today, he is also the author of Democratic Intergovernmental Organizations, Normative Pressures and Decision-Making Rules, published by Cambridge University Press in 2015. Also joining us today as discussant is Professor Jacint Jordana. Jacint Jordana is Professor of Political Science and Public Administration at University Pompeu Fabra and is the Director of Institut Barcelona de Estudis Internacionals. He is also the chair of the Globe Project, which is the project behind today's webinar. His publications include the edited books Accountability and Regulatory Governance by Palgrave in 2014, edited with Andrea Bianciulli and Xavier Fernandez Marin, and together with David Levy-Fauer, The Politics of Regulation by Edward Elgar, 2004, and The Rise of Regulatory Capitalism, The Global Diffusion of a New Order. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation by Alex of about 25 minutes. Then Jacint will start off the discussion by offering his reflections and asking a few questions, and Alex will have an opportunity to respond. Then we will turn to questions from you, the audience. Feel free to send questions to me throughout the webinar by using the webinar chat box function on the side of the webinar window. I will collect your questions to share with the speakers following the presentations. And before we begin, just a few quick words about the Globe Project. Funded by the European Commission's Horizon 2020 program, Globe seeks to understand the constraints and opportunities for the European Union in promoting its interests and values through global governance, with specific attention to four key areas: trade and development, security and migration, climate change, and global finance. The 3.5-year project aims to identify the major roadblocks to effective and coherent global governance by multiple stakeholders in a multipolar world, as well as to look ahead to 2030 and to 2050 in order to equip policymakers with the tools they will need to deal with future challenges. On behalf of the Globe Project, I would like to thank Alex and Jacint for joining us today. And now it is my great pleasure to give the floor to Alex. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Carrie, and thank you for everyone who is here. Let me do this. So yes, I'm going to be discussing my book. It came out in March 2020. Great time for a book to come out, obviously. What I'm going to do today is talk about the main concepts, especially intergovernmental and non-governmental, offer my main observation that we should be discussing an intergovernmental, non-governmental continuum rather than a dichotomy the way we have so far. I get to what I consider to be my most important question: when is global governance more likely to be intergovernmental or non-governmental? Not to keep you waiting, my main answer is that it's a lot about domestic preferences of the most powerful states that shape the nature of global governance and the intergovernmental and non-governmental nature. I'm also going to talk about how the book and a related article assess the plausibility of my arguments, and I'm going to offer briefly some of my findings and conclusions. So I know most of this audience already has a grasp of these concepts, but nevertheless, we talk about global governance in terms of how we deal with global problems when there is no global government. And also in terminology, we've been using the terms global governors, meaning the main actors who are involved in governing global issues. And traditionally, we've been thinking about the main global governors as states, obviously, especially the most powerful ones, and so-called international organizations. There are other global governors, but these are the main ones that people talk about. And when we discuss international organizations, there is this traditional distinction between intergovernmental organizations, IGOs, and international non-governmental organizations. The first are places where decisions are made by governments, and the other ones where decisions are made by transnational actors. And it seems like a fairly clear distinction and a simple one, but I'm hoping to convince you here, and obviously through my book, that the distinction is not as simple. When I've done this before, it was before the era of COVID. I did it in person and it was a little bit more interactive. I'm not going to be able to do that now. I'm going to lead this brief question and answer, and I'm going to answer myself, obviously. But what I want to do is to look at the various issue areas and to ask you, who do you think are the main global governors, and are they intergovernmental or non-governmental? And I'm going to start with what should be considered an easy one, peacekeeping. I mean, you can see that it says the UN. You would imagine that this is a very intergovernmental issue area, and it is indeed. But I should also mention that even in this example of a very intergovernmental form of global governments, we still have these days private military and security corporations that are playing increasingly important roles in resolving civil conflicts. This is not new. We've had mercenaries involved in conflicts for centuries. In addition to that, nowadays, there are many non-governmental international organizations that are involved in negotiating peace settlements. So even here, we see that it's not as simple as we may think. Those of you who have been in the United States during Halloween, you might have seen children walking around with these little boxes collecting money for UNICEF. But the fact is, they're not collecting money for the Intergovernmental Organization, United Nations Children's Fund. They're collecting money for the non-governmental organization, UNICEF USA. That in turn gives this money to the Intergovernmental Organization, but for projects that the non-governmental entity wants to fund. It's not the only one. As a matter of fact, United Nations Children's Fund, the primary global governor in children's issues, receives more than half of its budget from non-governmental organizations, which begs the question, how intergovernmental is it? How much does it do what governments want, and how much does it really do what non-governmental organizations want? The healthcare issue. Even before the recent politicization of the World Health Organization during COVID times, even as back as 2010, there was a cholera outbreak in Haiti, and a lot of people were asking whether the World Health Organization is irrelevant. The fact of the matter is, back then and later as well, many non-governmental organizations, Doctors Without Borders, were the first to step in, and sometimes the WHO did not really find a place to become involved. Moreover, these days we have the Gates Foundation that is the #1 funder of voluntary activities within the World Health Organization, and many other non-governmental organizations that also fund WHO. By the way, again, this is not new. Back in the interwar era, the Rockefeller Fund kept the League of Nations Health Organization alive. It wouldn't have existed had the Rockefeller Fund not brought in a little bit more than half the necessary funding to run the organization. The International Labor Organization, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. It's the poster child of a mixed international organization. Each country has 4 votes, 2 representing the government, 1 representing labor unions, 1 representing employers. Tourism. Now this is an intergovernmental organization, the UN World Tourist Organization, but it was established in 1934 as a non-governmental entity, and then in 1974, governments took over. This is not rare. Many intergovernmental organizations used to be non-governmental, and then they switched. There's also the reverse true. There are at least 2 organizations that used to be intergovernmental, the Intelsat and Inmarsat, that became private non-governmental entities back in the 1990s. So across time, there are changes within organizations and among organizations. Last but not least, in the technical standards realm, the main global governor is usually considered to be the International Organization for Standardization, and we tend to think about it as a very non-governmental organization. It was established back in 1925, but by now, more than half, closer to 2/3 of all delegations in this so-called non-governmental entity are actually represent their governments. So again, one can wonder how intergovernmental or non-governmental this organization is. So bottom line, my main argument that I want to present here is really that intergovernmental and non-governmental dichotomy is flawed. And this becomes especially a problem these days because we have come to operationalize international organizations. They're data sets that separate into intergovernmental or non-governmental. Obviously, we're missing a good deal of important detail by sticking to the dichotomy and not thinking about it in terms of a continuum. So I suggest that, yes, this should be thought about in terms of a continuum. I'm not the first to really hint at this. There have been others who've been talking that global governance can be mixed with multiple global governors being non-governmental or intergovernmental. In addition to that, I'm arguing that the organizations themselves are not as intergovernmental or non-governmental as we may think. So yes, I think it is better to think about this in terms of a continuum. And this is something pretty common within the social sciences. When we look more closely at our concepts, we tend to look at the more fine-grained, get a more fine-grained understanding. We don't talk about democracy anymore as a country being democratic or not. We look at the various dimensions of democracy, the degrees of democracy. It's not about having globalization or not. There are some countries that are more involved in globalization processes, others that are less. Times when we see greater degrees of globalization, less. In the same vein, I suggest that we should be talking about the degree of control in various issue areas and at different times that governments, rather than non-governmental actors, have. So when I'm talking about control over these organizations, I'm really thinking about three forms of control. Control over decision-making, control over funding, and control over ideational structures. The easy way to think about that is you look at an international organization and you ask, who's really voting? Who's really paying for this? Who's really speaking out? And these are the three dimensions of the continuum that I'm discussing. So bottom line, overall, I consider that international organizations and global governance as a whole can be more or less intergovernmental. Just to offer some representations of this variance across time and issue areas, this is a graph of the number of intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations that were established every single year. As you can see, they kind of go hand in hand, but not really. And if we do the ratio of each of new intergovernmental organizations and new international non-governmental organizations, we see that there are tremendous differences. Immediately after World War II, for every intergovernmental organization that was established, we have about 3 non-governmental organizations established. While back in the 1990s, we have close to 10 or even more non-governmental organizations established for every one intergovernmental organization. In terms of control over finances, here's an example. The International Committee of the Red Cross. As you can see, at different times, governments have given more or less of the funding to this organization, and that's true of most organizations. And in terms of participation, this is a graph of the number of international non-governmental organizations allowed to work with the League of Nations and the UN in a formal capacity. Variance as well. Let me offer another example of this variation that I'm seeing, and this is a fairly simpler issue area, the issue of education. Back in the second half of the 19th century, it was just non-governmental organizations that were involved. That's why I have an arrow at the end of this continuum closer to non-governmental. And until 1924, there were no intergovernmental organizations involved in education. Below the line, you see an attempt. Everything below the line is an attempt that was not successful. Immediately after World War I, within the League of Nations, there were a group of countries that wanted to establish an intergovernmental organization that would deal with education, among other things, in the League Intellectual Office. Most other countries said, no, this isn't something that governments should be dealing with. This is something that private entities should be involved with. Therefore, they continue to be non-governmental. And interestingly, in 1925, the countries that wanted an intergovernmental organization to deal with education came together to form a non-governmental organization, the International Bureau of Education, and that lasted until 1929. At that point, they ran out of money. It didn't work well. The same group of countries transformed the IBE into an intergovernmental organization. And that's why, as you can see on this line, it shifted. The global governance in education shifted from very non-governmental to very intergovernmental. This lasted until 1945, when UNESCO was established. And before going to the 1945-1950 period above the line, let me mention that there was an attempt in 1945. The French put forward a proposal to have UNESCO follow the same model of the International Labor Organization, meaning both non-governmental entities and government entities would have votes. Teachers unions and parents organizations would have votes just like governments would. It was not successful. It was an attempt. The reason I placed UNESCO so close to the middle from 1945 to 1950 is because it adopted a fairly non-governmental approach, even though it was intergovernmental. For every issue that they wanted to resolve after governments decided that they wanted to deal with that issue, they found a non-governmental organization that would actually step in and resolve that. They would pay that non-governmental organization money to deal with that issue. If there was no non-governmental organization that would deal with it, they would establish one. So again, it was a fairly middle of the road approach. Already by 1950, when the Soviet Union and its East European allies and many developing countries joined UNESCO, they pushed for a more governmental approach, and non-governmental organizations had a far smaller role to play. So much so that by 1980, the United States, the UK, left UNESCO, declaring it a statist organization, and started working more through UNICEF, when in terms of education, UNICEF, the World Bank, and very importantly, foundations. So overall, I would argue that since 1980, the issue area of education is somewhere in the middle with a combination of intergovernmental and non-governmental. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk about this, but I just wanted to point out that I go through a similar analysis for other issue areas. This is what happens in the health realm. So essentially, and this is another reflection of how I try to measure the various changes, I try to assess and to show that indeed there have been shifts across time in issue areas in whether the approach is more intergovernmental or non-governmental. There is a true ebb and flow when it comes to global governance. Obviously, when we see variation that needs to be explained in political science, that is a good thing. We try to find explanations for this. So the main question leading from this observation is, when will we see a more intergovernmental rather than a non-governmental approach to global governance? And my first attempt to answer this question was together with a doctoral student in an article that came out in 2019 in World Politics, where we basically looked at, it was a large N study that looked at the establishment of intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations, kind of the graphs that you saw earlier, and we tried to explain the variation across time looking at systemic factors. The degree of conflict in the world, of democracy, the number of new states in the world, and power concentration were not good predictors for us of whether the world is going more towards intergovernmental or non-governmental. We found a relationship between global wealth. The wealthier the world is, the more it tends to push towards non-governmentalism. The more economic informational flows and interactions, the more non-governmental it is. But the most important factor that we found was that decisions for more intergovernmental approaches to global governance are strongly connected to the degree of powerful states' domestic activism. Essentially, my argument is that governments export their activist approach in domestic politics to global governance. I'm not going to mention this here. It's in the book. I encourage you, obviously, to pick up the book and look at it. There's even a slide here, but I'm not going to go through that too much. Essentially, when you look at countries, and I take the example of the United States, I notice that at different times, leaders that tend to be take a more hands-on approach to domestic politics, a more governmental approach, also tend to take an intergovernmental approach to global governance. Those who take a more hands-off approach, a more non-governmental one to domestic politics, take a more non-governmental one in international politics as well. I argue that there are two reasons for this, two mechanisms. The first one is ideological. Basically, ideologies are defined as coherent sets of ideas. They cluster beliefs. They're the opposite of pragmatic approaches that imply having us choose belief systems that work best in a given situation. Well, Of course, the constraining effect of ideologies impacts not only beliefs and actions, clustering them across issue areas, but they cluster them across the domestic international divide. In the book, I offer more examples of this, but here just two quick examples of how ideology connects what countries do domestically and internationally. Roosevelt that made the argument, well, if we're emphasizing human rights domestically, we need to do the same thing internationally. Or the other way around, Margaret Thatcher, we have not successfully rolled back the frontiers of the state in Britain, only to see them reimposed at the European level. So essentially, I'm seeing this connection, this link between domestic and international ideological beliefs. There are two reasons for having this. The first one is simply cognitive dissonance. If you truly believe that non-governmental organizations need to play a role in domestic politics, it's very hard for you to say, oh, but not in international relations. Also, the other reason is, even if you don't necessarily believe that, it's very hard to not make the connection, because domestic audiences expect that. They can't expect you to say governments need to be involved in education domestically, but at the international level, it's just going to be non-governmental organizations. The second mechanism that connects the domestic and international realm, according to my findings, is the one of an institutional ones. In general, officials from domestic specialized offices often represent their governments in international forums. They may promote the country's interests, but we also know that they also promote their narrower organizational interests. And they have many such interests within international organizations. IOs allow domestic officials to acquire experience from others. They allow domestic institutions to grow their budgets once they become involved in such international organizations. They offer greater support for their policies. And of course, they offer prestige that comes from participating in these international forums. So my argument is that if there are many governmental institutions that are dealing with an issue, it's very likely that they're going to try to establish ties with each other internationally through intergovernmental organizations. If the issue area is non-governmental domestically, those non-governmental actors, when they come together internationally, are going to form international non-governmental organizations. A quick example, when UNESCO was established, actually it started in London during World War II. Richard Butler was the first Minister of Education, and as he was putting together the ministry, he was looking for projects, and one of those projects ended up being collaboration in the international realm. It was fairly easy for him at that time because he was speaking to about 8 ministers from governments in exile in London. My hypotheses, therefore, are that global governance is likely to shift towards intergovernmentalism when ideologies of domestic government activism become stronger, and global governance is likely to shift towards intergovernmentalism when domestic government institutions are established or enhanced in powerful states. This is a representation of the two processes. In the first one, with number 1, ideologies simultaneously leads to the establishment or empowerment of domestic government institutions and international intergovernmental organizations. Or alternatively, the second arrow, after such domestic institutions are established, slowly we have intergovernmental organizations or non-governmental organizations established due to this institutional mechanism. The 2019 article found support for the ideological argument, but due to the lack of good state-level data, I couldn't really test the institutional argument. The book traces developments over about 150 years across the 3 intergovernmental, non-governmental dimensions. I look at changes in IO decision-making, changes in funding, IO participation in international organization forums, and I choose 3 issue areas: health, labor, and technical standards. Other than the fact that they're important issue areas, I choose them because they reflect a different understanding of international organizations. The health issue area is generally seen as a very intergovernmental one. The labor one, as I mentioned, is seen as very hybrid, and the technical standards were non-governmental. I show that even though these are very different issue areas, there is variation on continuums across time in all of these issue areas. I also seek support for my hypotheses. In each of these empirical chapters, I ask a number of questions. What type of changes took place in the intergovernmental nature of global governance? So in the sense, I'm getting at the outcome variable. What dimension were these changes on? Were they towards intergovernmentalism or non-governmentalism? How did we get here? A second question that I ask is, how strong was government activism in the most important countries promoting or opposing changes to global governance? So this tries to get at support for either H1 or H2. Did officials promoting intergovernmentalism or non-governmentalism use arguments invoking specific ideologies? Which national institutions were represented? So basically, these other questions are getting at H1 and H2 separately. And last but not least, are there any alternative explanations, system level explanations for what I'm seeing? Don't worry, I'm not going to describe this too much. For each chapter, I come up with this label, with a table. As you can see, every single line is a moment in time, a case when a certain organization or several organizations shift. There are different types of changes, as you can see: decision-making, financial, deliberative, plus towards intergovernmentalism, minus towards non-governmentalism. I look at how the states, the most powerful states, what they were pushing for, and then towards the right, I look at question 3, question 4, question 5, support for the various hypotheses. I put this all together, and again, I'm running through this quickly because I'm hoping that you're going to pick up the book and open it up and see in greater detail how it's done, but I wanted to give you an idea of how I approach this. My findings. The issues move often across the intergovernmental, non-governmental continuum. There is indeed a true ebb and flow. My case studies identify exactly 50 moments of change, leading to 94 shifts across individual dimensions. This represents about one shift every 5 years in one specific issue area. That was surprising for me because it means that there's a lot of change across global governance. The second finding, which is, I think, perhaps even more important, is that this movement is from intergovernmentalism to non-governmentalism, but also back. And I mentioned this is important because recently we've been looking at what's been going on over the last 20, 30 years, and we've seen more non-governmentalism in the world. But according to my findings, this suggests that we should see back and forth. This era might end, with China taking a more important role in global governance and having a more hands-on approach to governance. Does that mean that global governance will push back towards more intergovernmentalism? What role will the European Union play in this game of pushing towards intergovernmentalism or non-governmentalism in the future? I also found that the systemic factors rarely explained the changes on their own. They do help in figuring out that a change will take place, but very rarely they could tell me whether the change would be towards intergovernmentalism or non-governmentalism. I usually needed to complement these system level factors with state level ones, to look at the domestic governmental, non-governmental preferences of the most powerful states. And when I talk about the most powerful states, I think about the 1, 2, or 3 most powerful states in the system and their preferences. In terms of theory, the book offers support for the so-called new liberal approach of Muratchev and Putnam. And essentially, the argument is states still do matter to a great degree in international relations and in the global governance, even when non-governmental actors play a greater role in global governance. Oftentimes, it's because governments want that, push for that to happen. Thank you. Obviously, if you have questions, you can ask now, or again, I encourage you to read the book. That is pretty much what I wanted to say.
Thank you very much, Alex. That was a very interesting presentation of your arguments, and your research is really fascinating. Before we take questions from the audience, I'm going to turn the floor over to Jacint for his comments and questions. And Jacint, you have the floor.
Thank you, Kerry. Well, thank you very much for your presentation, Alex. I think that, well, the presentation, the book you wrote, it's a very important book. It provides a very, very interesting angle in the current discussions of global governance. You know that now there is we see an explosion or a boom in theories of global governance and international organizations. In recent years, many interesting books have came out. I think your book is one of the most important contributions in this debate. Probably, maybe the pandemic is not helping us to discuss more broadly in conferences, but I think it's going to have an important impact in the discussions about how we can understand global governance and the role of international organizations, and also future developments. That is what we are interested in our GLOBE project. I found really very, very interesting your approach using this idea of a continuous evolution from intergovernmentalism to non-governmentalism, instead of having this type of typologies based in two or more categories that are in a way very ideal types. No, you are the way you are presenting your research. This is really very convincing. No, to see that there can be processes that are not linear in the sense of going in one direction and then moving from one stage to another, but they can go, but they can vary, or they can increase or decrease according to different factors that you try to make sense. And this is not any, there is no any type of linear development towards more strong international formal or public governmental organizations. It can be an option, but there are many other options, and then it's just depending the sector and depends of many variables that you discuss. So I think this is very, very interesting approach, and prevents us against theories that try to explain the history of global governance as something that is only one way and going in some directions, no, whether more disaster or to very full public control, whatever. No, that you have here a lot of variation, as you said, to explain, but also to make us understand that global governance is very diverse. It's also oscillating depending on different factors, and this makes also very, very interesting, but also very different to study sometimes compared to the domestic level. No, when we study similar issues regarding the public-private also connection and the situation in many countries, we have a lot of hybrid public administration organizations. So, but this is maybe there are some similarities, but also there are many differences, and I think that you remark very well them. So, as I said, I enjoyed very much reading your book, and also make me also to think it out about, no, how we can focus the study of global governance, and how you can dialogue with other theories that also now develop in this sense. In this sense, I have some questions for you to open the discussion, and also ask you to react, to provoke you a little bit about how you can also to frame your book in this general discussion about global governance that is now going on. A first question, it's about that you don't discuss about delegation, about the idea, for example, the book by Elizabeth Hook, Lenz, and Gary Marx, about in their theory about international organizations, they provide a lot of importance to the role of whether the states delegate, provide autonomy, independence to secretariats, or to they also accept that states are not going to be always the veto players of the decisions of international organizations. No, what they say, political authority. It seems in your book that this is not an issue important for you. No, you assume that the states have the control of the governmental organizations if they are interested to have, and if not, well, they go for other types of support, or just for inhibition, they allow other types of non-governmental structures. So, but no, you don't assume the possibility that you have autonomous, non-dependent from states, international organizations to some extent. No, I wanted to ask to react on that. Why you choose this way and not take into account to some way as maybe another dimension that issue. No? You may also say the same for private organizations, international private organizations. They may be quite autonomous, or maybe also controlled by big business, big firms that they transmit only the interest, a sort of global lobby groups, or maybe they have some sort of trustees having autonomous goals, not dependent of interest from private firms. No, that's a way that you can see some parallelism in the private and in the public realm in the global governance. Well, this was one issue I wanted to raise for you. Another thing I wanted also to ask you, it's about you explain about the expansion of the state and the retreat of the state as one of the possible explanations for whether there is more expansion in intergovernmental organizations in a specific sector, and whether there are less or more non-governmental, no, which is a very interesting and good idea. No, I share in general your view, but I have some caveats on that. And one of these is that the states in general across along the 20th century has been expanding a lot in general. There has been not stable. The states has been moving from 10% of GDP as a public expenditure to over 40 or 50% in many cases. So it has been over the century, the 20th century has been observing a big expansion of the role of the state in almost all domains. No, this is not something stable that you see states that are going down and or expanding and making retreats or dismantling policies. No, what we observe is a general expansion. Sometimes there are some, as you refer, Margaret Thatcher, others in the 80s, some discussion about whether we reached too far in the expansion of the state. But what we observe when we analyze the expansion of the state is a continuous growth, even now. And when the growth is not in the expenditures, is on regulation. The state is expanding in regulatory activities all over the time in many different sectors. No? I will say that because I see your point about the ideology of the retreat of the state, and of course there is literature, but the fact is I am skeptical about this retreat compared to the dimension of the expansion. So you have some small retreats and big expansion. So it's not a similar size or a similar, you cannot put them in a similar, I would say, amount or similar dimension. No, the retreats are very small, very conjunctural, and they disappear, and they transform themselves from expanding in expenditure to expanding in more regulation. No, this is what many people has observed analyzing what happened in the 90s. No, and with Margaret Thatcher in the UK, they privatized few companies, but they started to do many more regulations over the years. No, it's another way of a state intervention. So in this sense, I'm not so convinced about how this difference in this asymmetric situation can also support the argument about the states are capable to influence the increase in non-governmental dimension in many sectors. No, but well, just a question for opening the discussion. And finally, I have another discussion about, or another question about this is more, I would say, some for the future of global governance, and it's about how do you see and how do you think your theory or your approach to global governance can deal with a potential dualization of global governance, where think about or a fragmentation of global governance. Think about China in the coming decades creating a structure of global governance by their own, separate or from the conventional one or the traditional one, led by United States and Europe. And then will this be possible in your structure to have two worlds of global governance competing with different models? Some, maybe one of them being with very different characteristics as the others in terms of the three dimensions you were referring. This is more as a speculation, but just we are interested in the future of global governance. No? In this sense, I wanted to know your views about those. So, and thank you very much for your presentation. And well, I stop here my comments on your work that I enjoy very much.
Thank you very much, Jacint, both for the kind words and also for the questions. Let me first mention something that I hope gets at all three questions. One of the important aspects, I think, of my research, not just in this particular book, but I'd say over the last 10, 15 years, has been my fascination with going back in time 100, 150 years ago and seeing patterns that replicate themselves now. Things that we have seen, and again, the ebb and flow. I agree with you that many of the things we are witnessing, or we've witnessed over the last 20, 30 years, or even after World War II, seem to be moving in the same direction. But that doesn't have to be the same. And again, I'm going to mention China that you mentioned in your third question. It's in this context of going back in time that I'm truly seeing that, yes, governments very often don't have a strong preference for global governance, whether it's education or whether it's health. They may indeed, as you say, delegate to a lot of these international organizations their tasks. But if you go back in time sufficiently, you see all those cases where governments draw the line. When the United States says UNESCO is too intergovernmental, we're not going to accept this. When the Soviet Union steps in and says, we don't want all these non-governmental organizations running around and telling us what to do. So the reason I emphasize the important role of powerful states is because I find those moments, they're not many. I would say that throughout the post-Cold War era, we kind of see them, but they're not as visible as when you go across time. And related to your first question of when do states really step in or when don't they really step in, my understanding, and by the way, I do believe that there is a strong analogy between what's happening domestically and internationally, is that when governments simply say, we do not want to get involved or we should not become involved in health, labor, and so on, somebody else steps in. Who is that somebody else? It can be an NGO, it can be business, it can be a foundation, it can be labor unions, somebody else. I acknowledge that all of these actors matter, but I think to some degree, my work, because it tries to focus on a long period of time, tries to remind everyone that when push comes to shove, powerful governments are going to step in. And even if we're talking about the Gates Foundation, apparently powerful non-governmental actors, businesses, when the Soviet Union, when China, when the US really wants a change, it is likely to happen. So that's my approach or my answer to the first question, acknowledging that there are many different non-governmental actors that matter and sometimes matter much more than the governments. To your second question, in terms of this continuous growth, I would urge you and others to look at the article in World Politics, because my measure of domestic governmentalism or non-governmentalism is pretty much exactly what you mentioned. The proportion in the most powerful countries of government expenditures to the GDP. That is, like you said, a very good reflection of how hands-on or hands-off a government is. I find that in the United States, what you mentioned, the states taking off and really becoming involved, is Roosevelt, the New Deal. That's when government grows. There's a period in the 1980s when there's a decline, Thatcher and Reagan. Then there's another moment, I would say, after them, when government is more involved. So and if you look at the interwar era, the 19th century, I do see that governments domestically aren't always becoming more powerful. You're right that I should also look at regulation. The problem with regulation is I can't get a good measure of that. I know there's some measures. So I agree with you that it seems that governments are becoming increasingly involved, but don't forget, so are non-governmental actors, many more. So I would say that the balance is still not certain. Your last question of this dualization, again, I would suggest that if we go back in time, we've seen it before. The Cold War was a dualization of global governance, if you think about it. The interwar era with Germany and Italy and Japan being really in a separate world than the others. So we've seen this before. And I agree with you that the closer we look at what's going on in global governance, the better we understand it. But if we take a step back and if we look at the aggregate, what we are seeing right now, in my opinion, if we look at the new bank for development, or I forgot the other bank that China has established, when China becomes involved in global governance, it wants governments to rule. It does not leave much room for non-governmental organizations. I think it would love an overall global governance, but a much more intergovernmental one that it can control together with its allies. That's my view of things. I might be wrong. We're always wrong when we're trying to guess the future. Who would have guessed what happened last year, for example? But the trend, I suggest that after each one of intergovernmentalism or non-governmentalism, we see at least some erosion of that model for a while. So those are my quick answers to questions that deserve much longer answers. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, both to Jacint and Alex, for kicking off this discussion. We have quite a few questions from the audience, so I think we might have time for maybe one larger round or two smaller rounds, as you prefer, Alex. So maybe I'll just start with 3 or 4 questions, and we'll see where we can go from there, because we have about 11 or 12 minutes left. All right, so we had several questions. I'll try to group these, kind of looking at issue-specific areas and wondering if you see some variation with regard to these trends for different issue areas. And the issue areas that have been brought up by Omar, Hoda, and Dirja are sustainability and development, climate change, technological disruptions, weapons of mass destruction, and cryptocurrency. With regard to the latter, specifically because they were born from this libertarian ideal of no state or third-party interference. And then, so that's kind of a group of 1 question, so I'll consider that sort of one. We also have one from Axel Marx wondering about, talking about how your theory sort of shifts on the actions of powerful states. And so with a more multipolar world, with more world powers, how do you expect these trends to look in the future? Will they become more intergovernmental or less? And then we have one from Joel Fisher, who's asking how you handle the rise of multinational corporations over the decades of the second half of the 20th century, since they've been rising considerably. Should they be examined outside the label of non-governmental organizations? And a question from myself, if I can be so bold as to sneak this in, since I have the floor right now. I was looking at some research by Ranjit Lal from 2017, and he's looking at autonomy of international organizations, and he looked at funding as one of the ways that organizations can get some more autonomy from states. And I'm wondering if you see a role of the IO actors themselves making these decisions to consciously seek out new forms of funding to gain more autonomy. And so if you see a little bit of that, maybe even if you have a situation where you have a bit more overbearing states in an effort to gain more independent authority for the organization themselves. So I'm wondering how you see that. So we start there and see if we have time for another round.
Sure. Thank you for all the questions. I'll try to group them somehow. Like all researchers, I'm biased, and in part I'm biased because I look at 3 issue areas. I chose them, I think, well. I chose them because they were either very intergovernmental or non-governmental, or apparently so. I chose them because I felt that they were important. But all the issues that you mentioned here, sustainability, climate change, cryptocurrency, all of these are important. I did find differences between the 3. there are issues that some governments, the powerful governments, care more about at one point. For example, even in the interwar era, the United States was not part of the League of Nations, but it cared deeply about economic issues, the Bruce Commission and so on. Also, it became involved through non-governmental actors in some other things. So I think another aspect is how important that particular issue is for the most powerful states. And I would simply mention that the issue areas that were mentioned by the audience are all new. It's hard for me, or I think they're new. Climate change, sustainability, cryptocurrency. I'm not sure if we can follow the variation across time, variation across issue areas. That can be done, and it would be interesting, but I haven't done it. And I've received suggestions for other issues, including human rights, by the way, which is also a fascinating one. So thank you for the questions. It just adds to other things that I need to think about. The question of powerful states, now that we live in a more multipolar system, well, again, in the article, I have a measure for that. What proportion of world power is controlled by one state, two states, or three states? That offers a reflection of the degree of hegemony, if you wish, in the world. I found that that does not matter. Of course, it's statistics. There's so many caveats, so many possibilities, but I didn't find support for this. I'm not sure how to think about it in today's world, because I think it also depends where you live. I live for another week with Donald Trump as my president. It's a different world, perhaps, than if you would live in China or if you would live in Europe. I still see in the US, because of that, a strong role for the state. I also believe that when we're talking about multipolarity, from my side of the ocean, we tend to see Europe, and we tend to look at the EU as an extraordinarily powerful actor. So even this question of multipolar or bipolar world, it's a question of degree. I don't think it would affect too much my approach. I may simply have to take more states into account and more of their preferences than, let's say, during the Cold War. Multinational corporations, each type of non-governmental actor is different. It's very hard to throw in a foundation, a non-governmental organization, a labor union, and a multinational corporation. What they all have in common is that when governments say, we want to become involved, they're pushed aside. We live in an era where multinational corporations are extremely important. We've had other periods, of course, by our measures right now. Again, this seems unique. It wasn't necessarily always the case. There have been ups and downs. And I'm not entirely convinced that in the next 50 to 100 years, multinational corporations are going to continue increasing in their role. It depends what China wants to do. It depends what Russia wants to do. It depends what the US, what the European Union. So each type of non-governmental actor will play an important role. I'm not convinced that multinational corporations should be treated completely differently than all the others. With a fine grain, yes, we need to look at each individual one. The bigger picture is I see important roles for all and similar roles. I was actually in touch with Rajit, and we were talking about some of his work, and in terms of the autonomy of international organizations. Well, even here, I would suggest this autonomy is given to some degree. When powerful states want to control those organizations, they clamp down. And be careful, I believe that it's an aggregate situation. It's not enough for the US or for China. It's usually, it takes a combination, it takes a negotiation between powerful actors and powerful states to say, this is the way we would like to see the World Trade Organization work from now on. This is the way we'd like to see the IMF or the World Bank work from now on. It's not really just one state. So there is some degree of autonomy, and actually some of the examples in my book are of international organizations that governments do not want to help out. I mentioned the Health Organization of the League of Nations. And as an official in the League of Nations, you are going to be out of a job if you don't have funding for your projects. What do? They go hat in hand to the Rockefeller Foundation. They would not have done that had the French government, the British government said, yes, we believe health is an important issue, we're going to fund this. So this autonomy of international organizations exists, but even this is a question of degree, especially when governments say, no, this is too important for us, we're not going to allow anybody else to become involved. Sorry for the wishy-washy answer. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think we are sort of out of time for another round, but I will pass along these other questions that we got to you. And if you care to follow up, I can make that happen and we can go from there. But I want to thank you so much for this very interesting presentation and also for this great discussion that we've had so far. And thank you to the audience for sending in all these great questions. And before leaving you, I'd like to announce that our Globe webinar series will continue next month with a webinar on the 15th of February featuring Juan Diaz-Medrano on his book, Europe in Love, Binational Couples and Cosmopolitan Society. And you can register for that webinar, and you can check out the rest of our webinar series for the winter and spring. We have webinars lined up basically through June at globe-project.eu, and you can also watch all the previous episodes of the Globe webinar series there. We also have a bunch of publications and blog series to check out. Thank you again for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon. From all of us at the Globe Project, thank you and goodbye.
Thanks very much.